Welcome to the Living with Narcissists podcast, where the first recommendation is don't. But unfortunately, that's not always possible. So this is your haven for validation, insight, strategies, and resources. So let's get started. Welcome, I'm Carrie, and this is the Living with Narcissists podcast. In the last episode, we talked about trauma, which is the experience of a very stressful, frightening, or harrowing event that is difficult to cope with or out of our control. So far, this has been the most difficult episode that I've put together, and I believe that's because, number one, trauma is very complicated, and number two, if you've experienced trauma, as you go through the list of symptoms of having trauma, PTSD or C-PTSD, it can cause triggering that activates memories of past trauma. So please be aware, trigger warning, you may have emotional or physical reaction to this discussion. So if you do, no worries. You could pause and come back to it at a later time after your nervous system is calmed down. So let's get started. Trauma has three parts: the event, which is the beginning, the experience of the event, which is the middle, and the effect of the event, which is the end. And there are three main types of trauma: acute, chronic, or complex. Acute trauma results from a single incident. Chronic trauma is repeated and prolonged, such as domestic violence or community violence, or maybe being bullied at school. As we learned in the previous podcast, more than 33% of youths exposed to community violence will experience PTSD, a very severe reaction to traumatic events. Complex trauma, which is exposure to varied, multiple traumatic events, often of an invasive interpersonal nature. So, for example, you live in a home where domestic violence is occurring, you're sexually assaulted at camp, your house burns down, and your mother dies. That would be an example of a person who's experienced varied, multiple traumatic events that can lead to C-PTSD. If a person develops simple PTSD from experiencing a single traumatic event, within approximately 1 month, they will recover and move on to their lives and resume healthy functioning. If the trauma is not resolved within a month, the individual may have developed PTSD or C-PTSD. PTSD tends to result from long-term chronic trauma, and complex post-traumatic stress disorder, C-PTSD, is often referred to as childhood PTSD. When you have suffered from trauma, you can feel like you're on a hamster wheel, reliving the terror of the traumatic event or events in visual images, emotional states, or nightmares. So basically, a traumatic event or events with no end. An anxiety that is whirring in the background, like an unused open app that is running on your phone and draining your battery. So how do we know if we have PTSD or C-PTSD? In the DSM-5, the diagnosis of PTSD is given when all 8 of the following symptom criterion are fulfilled. So let's go through the symptom criterion for PTSD, and then we'll move on and explain how PTSD is different from C-PTSD. So the first criterion is the stressor, the event that occurred, and you only need one of these. So basically, the person was exposed to or threatened with death, serious injury, or sexual violence. It can be direct exposure, it could be witnessing the trauma, or learning that a relative, close friend was exposed to a trauma, or indirect exposure to adverse details of the trauma, usually if you were a first responder. So I'd like to give an example of this that I think that people throughout the world could relate to, because I'm very surprised. I have people from all over the world listening to this, because this is a human condition. And no matter what your ethnicity is, what part of the world that you're living in, what your socioeconomic situation is, you are a human being. And human beings respond to trauma in similar ways. So, I like to use the example of 9/11 because that is something that a lot of people throughout the world are familiar with, because most people have witnessed the event on TV and were aware that it occurred at the time that it happened. And you could probably tell from my accent that I live in the New York City metropolitan area. So it really hits home for me. Direct exposure, people that were in the planes or were in the immediate area, the buildings at the time that the traumatic event occurred, when the first plane went into the World Trade Center. People who witnessed the trauma. Everybody throughout the world either witnessed it in person, if you happened to be in Manhattan at the time, or Brooklyn, or even Queens, or New Jersey, looking across in real time, seeing this happen, or if you were in other areas, in the surrounding area or throughout the world, you saw it on TV. So most of the people in the world witnessed the trauma of 9/11. And for some of us that had people on the planes or that had people in the buildings and surrounding areas learned that a relative or a close friend was exposed to the trauma. I actually am in that group. I witnessed the trauma, and I also learned that a relative and close friends were exposed to the trauma. My children had to go to school with children who lost parents on 9/11. So that was very difficult for all of us. And then there are people that were first responders, not only people in the immediate area, but people throughout the United States that came to the ground zero area to try to help people that were trapped, hoping that they were survivors, or people that were trying to remove the debris. Those people, the first responders, saw a lot of horrors going to the area to try to provide help. So in that one traumatic event, we have stressors that actually have occurred for all of these criterion. But if you have one of these, then you would fulfill the first criterion A for post-traumatic stress disorder. So criterion B, also only one required, intrusive symptoms. So the traumatic event is persistently being re-experienced in unwanted upsetting memories, nightmares, flashbacks, emotional distress like fear or shame, when you're exposed to reminders of the traumatic events, or physical reactivity after exposure to reminders of the traumatic events. So your body might start releasing cortisol, which will make you feel anxious. And then we have criterion C, which is avoidance. Only one of these are required as well. So avoidance of the trauma-related trigger that creates thoughts or feelings. You don't want to talk about it. You don't want to deal with it because of the thoughts or feelings that it creates. Or avoidance of external reminders. So maybe after 9/11, you're afraid to fly on a plane, or maybe you're afraid to go into Manhattan, or you're afraid to go into tall buildings. Criterion D, 2 of these are required. That's negative alterations in cognitions and mood. So negative thoughts or feelings that begin to worsen after the trauma, and that would happen in the following ways. You'd have an inability to recall the key features of the trauma. That's sometimes called trauma amnesia. You have overly negative thoughts and assumptions about oneself or the world. So maybe after 9/11, you felt that the entire world was evil and that you couldn't trust anybody and you wanted to isolate. You have exaggerated blame of yourself or others for causing the trauma. So maybe you feel blame because you were happy when your spouse got a job at the World Trade Center, or you feel exaggerated blame because you encouraged a person to take a flight somewhere that ended up being one of the planes that went into the World Trade Center. So now you feel responsible for what happened to this person. You have a complete negative effect. So all of the vibrational energy that's coming out of you is all negative by nature, and other people feel the negativity that you are presenting with the effect that you have. Decreased interest in activities. A lot of people, after seeing what happened on 9/11, became a little recluse and didn't even want to get up and eat or take care of their regular responsibilities. And I could say that that was one of the first things that I noticed after 9/11, is that I didn't have the desire to do anything. I didn't even want to eat. Feeling isolated. I didn't even want to go out of my house. I wanted to be isolated because I didn't feel anybody understood how I was feeling. And I also didn't want to go out and interact with people. And I also, the last is difficulty feeling a positive effect. So you don't feel like watching a movie. You don't feel like playing cards. You don't feel like doing something fun. You don't feel like pursuing educational or occupational goals. It really is like a shutdown in your mood, or aggression or anger, because of negative alterations in your thinking. Criterion E is you have alterations in arousal and reactivity. So you may become irritable or aggressive. You may engage in risky or destructive behavior. You may feel hypervigilant, so you're looking for trouble around every corner. You hear a plane going through the sky, you feel like they're going to crash into your house. You have a heightened startle reaction. So as soon as you hear or see something that's unexpected, you have a very strong startle reaction. You have difficulty concentrating, which some people call brain fog. And you also have difficulty sleeping, which is very bad, especially if you can't fall asleep within 72 hours, because you can have other symptoms like hallucinations. So if you are not sleeping or know someone who isn't sleeping, please make sure that you get help for that, because it will get worse. Criterion F which is required, is about duration, which we mentioned earlier, which is that if you have PTSD, the symptoms will last for more than 1 month. Criterion G is functional significance. This is also required. The symptoms create so much distress that you can have functional impairment with family, social relationships, educational, occupational goals, and any other important area of functioning. Criterion H is an exclusionary criterion, which is also required, and that says that all of the symptoms that you have are not due to medication, substance use, or some other type of illness like a traumatic brain injury from getting hit in the head by maybe falling or something, falling onto you. Now, that's the symptom criteria for PTSD as per the DSM-5. But the diagnosis of complex PTSD is actually a relatively new diagnosis, which was first proposed by Judith Herman in 1992. She's an American psychiatrist, researcher, teacher, and author of the book Trauma and Recovery. I'll put her information in the show notes in case you want to read her book. I highly recommend it, and so you don't need to write that down now. But Herman proposed a syndrome that is a separate diagnosis from PTSD, which she called complex post-traumatic stress disorder, C-PTSD. Herman suggested that this disorder is more likely to manifest following traumas that occur in childhood, that are prolonged, and that are interpersonal. Inclusion of C-PTSD was considered for the DSM-5, but the committee chose to exclude it because at that time there was too little empirical evidence supporting Herman's original proposal that this is a separate diagnosis. However, the World Health Organization, which has its own manual of mental health disorders, is called the International Classification of Diseases, ICD. They're up to the 11th revision, but that was published in 2019, as opposed to the DSM-5, which was published in 2013. So the ICD 11th edition is the most current, and that is the book that is used throughout the world. The DSM is actually what's used in North America. So maybe in the next edition of the DSM, we will see that C-PTSD is included because much more research has been done since 2013. But a diagnosis of C-PTSD is made when the criteria for PTSD is met, plus 3 additional symptoms, which are called disturbances in self-organization, or DSO. So a person with C-PTSD would have the core symptoms of PTSD, which is re-experiencing, avoidance, hyperarousal, and reactivity, plus the disturbances in self-organization, DSO. So what are the symptoms for DSO? Well, the first is difficulty regulating your emotions. The second is a negative self-concept, such as guilt, shame, and loneliness. And the last is interpersonal problems that make it difficult to build and maintain healthy, fulfilling, long-term relationships. So now we understand the difference between trauma, PTSD, and C-PTSD. In the next episode, we will learn about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and how that can create trauma and insecure attachment. So I hope that you'll tune in next time. I hope that this has helped you get a better understanding of trauma. And we're going to push along through trauma so that we can go back to narcissism, because insecure attachment and cluster B personality disorders are created through the lens of trauma. So thank you very much. I look forward to moving on in the next episode. I think that you'll find ACEs very interesting and enlightening. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope this information is helpful. If you like my content, please choose to follow, subscribe, or provide a rating so I can share this information with more people and you don't miss out on future episodes. I look forward to sharing more in the future. Have a wonderfully peaceful day. Till next time.